Hello and welcome back to the Calm Curator. I'm glad you're here tonight, wherever in the world you might be. Maybe you're winding down after a long day, or perhaps you're on a quiet evening walk. However you found your way here, I hope this journey brings you somewhere interesting. Before we begin, I'm curious, have you ever held real silk in your hands, felt that impossible smoothness? I'd love to know what brings you here tonight, and as always, where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below. Tonight, we're tracing one of history's most remarkable stories. Not the story of one person or even one civilization, but the story of a path, or really many paths, that connected half the world for nearly 2,000 years. We are walking, at least in our minds, along the Silk Road. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this network of ancient trade routes changed everything about how human beings see themselves and each other. So find somewhere comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Picture this. You're standing in a workshop in Chang'an, the city we now call Xi'an, around 200 BCE. The air is thick with carefully controlled humidity, because what happens in this room requires exact conditions. A woman sits at a loom, her fingers moving with the kind of speed that only comes from years of practice. She's probably been watching these movements since she was a child, learning from her mother, who learned from her mother. But it's not the loom that catches your attention, it's what she's making. Thread so fine you can barely see it catches the light like captured water. The fabric taking shape under her hands seems to glow, rippling with each movement like the surface of a pond. This is silk, and right here, right now, it's one of the most valuable things on earth. The secret of making silk, sericulture, if you want the fancy term, was one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the ancient world. The Chinese had been raising silkworms and harvesting their cocoons for maybe 3,000 years by this point. They knew something nobody else in the world knew, that this humble little worm, munching on mulberry leaves, could produce a fiber so extraordinary that emperors and kings thousands of miles away would pay almost anything to own it. The process itself is kind of miraculous when you think about it. The silkworm produces one single, continuous thread that can stretch for almost a kilometer as it spins its cocoon. That thread, finer than a human hair, has to be carefully unwound before the creature inside breaks free and damages it. Several threads get twisted together to make silk fiber that can be woven into fabric. What you end up with is something that's both strong and delicate, warm and cool, that takes dye in ways that create colors you can't quite believe. Here's what matters for our story. The secret of how to make silk stayed exclusively Chinese for centuries. People throughout Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe knew about silk. They wanted it desperately, traded for it, even fought over it. But they didn't know where it came from. Some thought it grew on trees, others imagined some kind of spider made it. The mystery only made it more valuable. By the time of the Han Dynasty, starting around 206 BCE, silk had become more than luxury fabric. It was currency. Chinese emperors gave silk as diplomatic gifts, used it to pay armies, and traded it for horses from the nomadic peoples of the steppes. And more, silk was moving westward, carried by traders who understood that the farther you took it from its source, the more it was worth. This is where our road starts to take shape, not as one single path carved into the earth, but as a network of routes connecting the great civilizations of the ancient world. From Chang'an, the magnificent capital of Han China, routes stretched west through the Hexi Corridor, that narrow strip of livable land squeezed between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert. From there, paths split and reconnected like branches of a river, flowing around the terrible Taklamakan Desert, whose name supposedly means "go in and you won't come out." Some routes curved north, following the foothills of mountains. Others bent south along different ranges. These paths connected oasis towns that were like islands of life in seas of sand and stone, places with names that sound like poetry: Kashga, Khotan, Dunhuang, Turpan. Each was its own world, where traders from dozens of different cultures met to exchange not just goods but stories, techniques, and ideas. Beyond the deserts, the routes climbed into the high mountain passes of the Pamirs, sometimes called the roof of the world. Up there, the air gets so thin that every breath feels like it's not enough. Mountains surround you in every direction like frozen waves. Crossing these passes meant dealing with cold that could kill you, altitude that left the strongest people gasping, and isolation so complete that a caravan might travel for weeks without seeing another person. But those who made it through found themselves in lands of surprising wealth and ancient culture. The routes came down into the great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv, each of them centers of learning, culture, and trade that could match anything in China or Europe. Here, Persian influence mixed with Greek legacy from Alexander's conquests, creating entirely new cultures. The architecture featured domes that seemed to defy gravity, markets overflowed with goods from everywhere in the known world, and scholars debated mathematics and philosophy in languages borrowed from half a dozen different peoples. From Central Asia, routes branched out. Some continued west toward Persia, toward the capitals of successive Persian empires, the Parthians, who controlled the region during Roman times, and later the Sasanians. These Persian kingdoms understood their position as middlemen between East and West, and they played that role brilliantly, controlling the flow of goods and ideas, adding their own contributions, taking their cut. Other routes turned southwest toward India, where ancient trade networks had existed forever. India added its own treasures, precious stones, fine cotton that rivaled Chinese silk, spices that could transform food, and maybe most importantly, ideas. Buddhism, which started in northern India, traveled these routes northward and eastward, eventually changing the spiritual landscape of all of East Asia. Still other paths led through Syria and the great trading cities like Palmyra and Damascus until they reached the Mediterranean. Here, at the western end of the land routes, silk and other Eastern goods entered the Roman world. Wealthy Romans developed such an appetite for silk that Roman writers complained it was draining the empire of gold. And honestly, they had a point. The balance of trade favored the East throughout most of this period. But here's the thing, the Silk Road wasn't really just about silk. That's actually kind of a misleading name. The term Silk Road wasn't even used until the 1800s, when a German geographer coined it. The people who actually traveled these routes didn't think of them as one road, and they certainly weren't only trading silk. The routes carried everything, anything valuable enough to justify the cost and danger of transport across thousands of miles. Imagine walking through the Grand Market of Samarkand around the year 500 CE. The scale is overwhelming. It sprawls across several city blocks, covered in places by awnings that create patterns of light and shadow. The noise hits you first, dozens of languages being spoken at once, merchants calling out, coins clinking, camels complaining, donkeys braying, the sound of craftsmen at work. But the smells really transport you. Someone nearby is grinding spices, and the air carries cinnamon, cardamom, and something sharp you can't identify, maybe asafoetida from Persia or star anise from the Far East. It mingles with the smell of leather, the sharp tang of dyes, the sweetness of dried fruits piled high, and underneath it all, that smell of human commerce, sweat and dust and possibility. Your eyes can barely take it all in. Fabric is everywhere. Silk, yes, in colors so vivid they almost hurt, imperial yellow and bright red, deep blue and emerald green, but also cotton from India in shifting patterns. Wool from the steppes woven into carpets that'll last generations, linen from Egypt. But textiles are just the beginning. There are spices, peppercorns from India's coast, each one worth its weight in silver by the time it reaches Rome. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka. Saffron from Persia, each thread representing hours of careful work. Ginger and turmeric and cloves, each with both cooking and healing properties. Over here, precious stones. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, deep blue shot through with gold-colored veins, prized for jewelry and ground into paint pigment. Jade from the mountains, cool and smooth, carved into decorative objects. Pearls from the Persian Gulf. Coral from the Mediterranean. Metals too, gold and silver obviously, but also bronze alloys whose recipes are trade secrets. Steel from India that makes legendary blades. Tin from distant Britain that most people here have never heard of. Glass vessels from Syria and Egypt, some clear, some colored. And everywhere art objects, bronze mirrors from China polished to impossible smoothness, carved ivory from Africa, miniature paintings on silk showing real or imagined landscapes, ceramic vessels with glazes that seem to glow, musical instruments shaped to make sounds unlike anything available locally. But maybe most valuable of all, though you can't see them on display, are the ideas traveling these routes. Technologies that will change civilizations. Paper making, which started in China and would eventually reach the Islamic world and then Europe, transforming education and record keeping. Printing techniques also from China. Gunpowder formulas, mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, medical knowledge about herbs and treatments. Religious and philosophical ideas traveled too, often with more impact than any physical cargo. Buddhism journeyed from India through Central Asia to China, changing along the way, adapting while keeping its core insights. Christian communities established themselves along the Silk Road. Zoroastrianism and eventually Islam all found followers among the trading communities, all influenced each other. The very languages people spoke started reflecting this mixing. Sogdian, the language of one of the great Central Asian trading peoples, borrowed words from Chinese, Persian, and Sanskrit, becoming a common language of commerce. Persian absorbed influences from Greek, Arabic, and Turkish. Chinese picked up loan words for things that had no Chinese names, certain foods, musical instruments, religious concepts. The influence on art and architecture is still visible today. Chinese pottery started showing Persian and Central Asian designs. Persian paintings used techniques from Chinese art. Byzantine mosaics incorporated designs from Eastern textiles. The way people dressed reflected these exchanges: robe styles, ways of wrapping turbans, jewelry designs, all flowing along the trade routes. Food traveled and transformed too. Noodles, whether they started in China or the Middle East, is still debated, but they definitely traveled both ways. Spices that began as medicines became cooking staples. Rice cultivation techniques spread west. Grape growing and winemaking moved east. Each culture took what others offered and made it their own, creating fusion cooking centuries before that was even a term. But who were the people actually moving these goods? Here's something important: almost nobody traveled the entire length of the Silk Road. The distances were too vast, the dangers too great, the time too long. Instead, goods passed through many hands. Each merchant specialized in a particular section, took their profit, and passed items to the next link in the chain. Chinese merchants might take silk to their empire's western borders. There they'd trade with Central Asian middlemen, often Sogdians, who dominated this business for centuries. These Central Asian traders would move goods across the deserts and mountains, selling to Persian merchants, who'd carry things west into the Mediterranean world or south into India. Indian traders would move goods north into Central Asia and south to see routes connecting with Arabia and Africa. The caravans themselves were massive undertakings. Imagine organizing the logistics of moving hundreds of people and animals across thousands of miles of difficult terrain, through regions with bandits, hostile armies, sandstorms, blizzards, or just the grinding challenge of crossing deserts where water sources were days apart. The lead merchants were sophisticated people, multilingual, good with numbers, able to judge quality and value, skilled at negotiation, knowledgeable about local customs and laws. They needed to understand the political situation everywhere they went, knowing which authorities needed bribes or taxes, which routes were safe, which towns had water and supplies. They were bankers and diplomats as much as merchants. The caravans they organized were mobile communities. Besides the merchants, there were guards, armed men hired to protect valuable cargo, camel drivers and horse handlers, experts in animal care. Guides who knew the routes intimately, who could find water and navigate by stars and landmarks, who understood the desert's moods and the mountain's dangers. And there were others. Pilgrims using the caravan's protection for religious journeys, scholars traveling to study in distant lands, diplomats on official missions, adventurers seeking fortune, performers and craftsmen hoping to find work in distant cities. A large caravan might include hundreds of people and thousands of animals, stretching for miles, a temporary traveling city. The animals deserve their moment too. The Bactrian camel, the two-humped kind native to Central Asia, was perfect for these journeys. Unlike the single-humped dromedary of Arabia, the Bactrian could handle both extreme heat and bitter cold, go for days without water, carry hundreds of pounds, and cross terrain that would stop most pack animals. Horses were essential too, both for riding and as trade goods. Chinese emperors especially prized the heavenly horses of Central Asia, likely ancestors of modern occultique horses, animals larger and stronger than native Chinese horses. The Chinese would pay extraordinary prices for these horses, sometimes their weight in silk. Yaks worked in the high mountain passes, their thick coats letting them survive at altitudes that would kill other animals. Donkeys and mules provided steady transport. Even dogs played their part, guarding camps and warning of danger. Let's follow one of these caravans more closely. Imagine joining a group leaving Kashgar, that great oasis city at the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert, headed towards Samarkand. It's early morning. Caravans usually started before dawn to avoid the heat. The scene is controlled chaos, hundreds of camels being loaded with balanced packs, their complaints echoing off the city walls. Merchants conducting last-minute business, securing credit, saying goodbye to family they might not see for months or years. You join the line as the caravan starts moving, and at first it's almost pleasant. The land around Kashgar is green with irrigation from mountain snowmelt, but within days the greenery fades, the ground gets harder, dustier. The air dries out, you're entering the desert. The rhythm of travel becomes predictable. Walk until the heat becomes unbearable, rest during the hottest hours, move again in late afternoon and evening, sometimes traveling at night when the moon gives enough light. Water becomes the constant worry. The guides lead from oasis to oasis, from well to well, calculating exactly how far you can go on the water the camels can carry. The desert isn't silent. There's the constant crunch of footsteps on sand and gravel, camels groaning, leather and wood creaking, conversation in multiple languages. At night, there's wind, sometimes gentle, sometimes howling. Some travelers swear they hear voices in the wind, calling them, trying to lead them astray. These might be spirits, or more likely just wind and acoustics and tricks a tired mind plays. The days blend together. The landscape changes slowly, sometimes vast stretches of gravel, sometimes real sand dunes like frozen waves, sometimes badlands of eroded rock in shapes that seem deliberately carved. The sky dominates everything, enormous and empty, the sun a furnace by day, the stars a river of light by night. Then after weeks, the oasis appears. First as a smudge on the horizon you're not sure is real. Then as green so vivid after all that brown it almost hurts. Then as a town, with walls and gates and the blessed sound of running water. The relief is physical. The caravan speeds up despite exhaustion, drawn toward water and rest. These oasis towns were remarkable. They existed in some cases for thousands of years, maintained through incredibly sophisticated irrigation, bringing water from underground or distant mountains. They were multicultural by necessity. You might find Chinese merchants, Persian scholars, Indian monks, Turkic warriors, and Arab traders all in the same marketplace, somehow making themselves understood despite language barriers. The towns were also centers of culture and learning. Dunhuang, for instance, had the Mogao caves, where Buddhist monks created extraordinary murals and preserved thousands of manuscripts. These weren't backwaters but sophisticated cities with their own artists, craftsmen, scholars, and traditions. They took elements from every culture passing through and created something unique, but the caravan can't stay long. After a few days of rest and resupply, it's time to move. The next part of the journey might take you into the mountains, the Pamirs or Tian Shan, or any of the other ranges that make Central Asia one of the world's most dramatically vertical regions. Mountain travel brings new challenges. The thin air at high altitude makes everything exhausting. You find yourself stopping to catch your breath after a few dozen steps. The cold cuts deep, especially at night, even in summer. The trails are often narrow, clinging to cliff faces, with terrifying drops nearby. Rock slides and avalanches are constant dangers, and there's always the risk of altitude sickness, which can strike anyone. Yet the mountains have their own stark beauty. The silence is different from desert silence, more complete, more profound. The air is so clear that distant peaks seem touchable. The night sky at altitude is overwhelming, the Milky Way bright enough to cast shadows, planets visible as disks, shooting stars so common you stop pointing them out. And then, finally, descending the western slopes, you catch your first glimpse of Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Even from far away, you can see the gleam of tiled domes, minarets reaching skyward. As you get closer, the city's sophistication becomes obvious. The scale of the buildings, the visible wealth, the complexity of the society that created and maintains this place. This is where our imagined merchant might end his journey, selling his goods to Persian traders who will carry them west. But before we leave him, let's appreciate what he and thousands like him accomplished. They connected civilizations that might never have met otherwise. They made it possible for a Roman senator to wear silk, for a Chinese emperor to taste Persian dates, for an Indian mathematician's discoveries to reach scholars in Baghdad. Some people who traveled the Silk Road became legendary. The most famous is probably Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who claimed to have spent years in the court of Kublai Khan in the late 1200s. Whether all his stories were true, whether he even made it to China, as some scholars debate, his account fascinated medieval Europe, and shaped how the West understood the East. Reading Marco Polo, you get a sense of wonder that never fades. He describes cities of incredible size and sophistication, technologies unknown in Europe, customs that seem almost unbelievable. Paper money particularly amazed him, the idea that mere paper, because the Khan said so, could have value throughout his vast empire. He wrote about coal, barely used in 13th century Europe, but mined and burned by the Chinese for centuries. He described postal systems that could move messages across vast distances impossibly fast. But Marco Polo wasn't the first to document these routes. That honor might belong to Xuanzang, a Chinese Buddhist monk who journeyed to India in the 600s to collect sacred texts and learn from Indian masters. His travel account provides invaluable information about Central Asian kingdoms and Indian states of his time. He traveled for 17 years, covering over 10,000 miles on foot and horseback, facing bandits, political troubles, harsh weather, and bureaucratic obstacles. Xuanzang's motivations were spiritual rather than commercial, but his impact was huge. He brought back hundreds of Buddhist texts to China and spent the rest of his life translating them, fundamentally shaping Chinese Buddhism. His journey inspired countless others and became the basis for one of China's most famous novels, though the novel is far more fantastical than the actual journey. Then there's Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who in the 1300s traveled farther than perhaps anyone in the pre-modern world, some 75,000 miles over nearly 30 years. His account provides an Islamic perspective on Silk Road lands and beyond. He traveled through North Africa, down the East African coast, across the Middle East, through Central Asia, into India where he served as a judge, and eventually to China itself. Ibn Battuta's observations are remarkable for their detail and how he notices what's different from his own culture. He comments on marriage customs, legal systems, architecture, food, clothing, social structures. He's not always sympathetic, some practices shock him, but he records what he sees in enough detail that modern historians can use his account to understand societies that left few other written records. These famous travelers were exceptions. Most people using the Silk Road were just trying to make a living, fulfill obligations, get from one place to another. But their collective efforts created something extraordinary. A connected world where goods and ideas could flow from the Pacific to the Atlantic, where innovations in one place could spread to benefit people thousands of miles away. Yet the journey was never safe. Bandits were a constant threat, organized groups who knew the routes and schedules, who could strike fast and disappear into desert or mountains. Some were opportunistic raiders, others basically ran protection rackets, demanding payment for safe passage. Merchants had to balance the cost of enough guards to prevent attacks against what those guards added to the already expensive journey. Political instability created its own dangers. The Silk Road passed through numerous kingdoms, empires, and tribal territories, each with its own rulers and laws. A change in government might mean new taxes, new restrictions, or open warfare that closed routes entirely. The rise and fall of empires could make routes safe for generations suddenly impossible. Natural disasters posed threats no preparation could eliminate. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans. Floods could wash away trails and bridges. Earthquakes were common in these geologically active regions. Avalanches could strike without warning. Disease could sweep through a caravan, and limited medical knowledge meant even treatable conditions could become fatal. And there was the simple grinding challenge of distance and time. A journey from Chang'an to Rome could take years, meaning merchants spent most of their adult lives away from home and family. Many never returned, dying on the road from disease, violence, or exhaustion. The physical demands were extraordinary, walking or riding for months, enduring temperature extremes, eating unfamiliar food or going hungry, never quite sure if the next town would be friendly or hostile. Yet people made these journeys for centuries, creating a system of commerce and cultural exchange that shaped the entire Eurasian world. The Silk Road reached its peak during several periods. Under the Han Dynasty and the contemporary Roman Empire, the first great flowering of East-West trade occurred. Then, after decline during the centuries following Rome's fall, trade revived under the Tang Dynasty in China and the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East and Central Asia. The Mongol Empire, despite its reputation for destruction, actually created the most extensive and secure period of Silk Road trade. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a single authority controlled routes from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. The Mongols understood trade's value and actively encouraged it, protecting merchants, maintaining roads and way stations, establishing a postal system that could move messages across their empire faster than would be possible again until the telegraph. But this golden age contained seeds of the Silk Road's decline. Mongol enforced peace meant routes were open not just to goods, but also to disease. The Black Death, which devastated Eurasia in the 1300s, likely spread along the Silk Road, its transmission helped by the very connections that had brought prosperity. The plague killed maybe a third of the population where it hit, disrupting trade, emptying cities, creating political instability that would take generations to overcome. Even as the overland routes recovered from the plague, they faced a new challenge: the sea. Maritime trade had always existed. Indian Ocean routes had carried goods between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia forever. But in the 1400s and 1500s, European powers developed ships and navigation techniques that let them establish direct sea routes to Asia, bypassing Silk Road middlemen entirely. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498, he opened a new chapter in global trade. Ships could carry far more cargo than caravans, and despite sea travel dangers, ocean routes were often faster and more reliable than overland paths. The Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the English established trading posts and eventually colonies along Asian coasts, creating a maritime empire that gradually replaced overland Silk Road trade. The final blow came from political changes in Central Asia itself. The rise of new empires and fall of old ones disrupted the stable conditions trade required. Routes became more dangerous, less profitable, less essential as sea trade expanded. One by one, the great oasis cities declined. Some were abandoned entirely. Others shrank to shadows of former glory. The caravanserais, those way stations that had provided shelter and services, fell into ruin. By the 1700s, the Silk Road as a functioning trade network had essentially ceased to exist. The routes were still there, still traveled by local merchants and pilgrims, but the great transcontinental trade that had defined them was gone. The age of the caravan gave way to the age of the sailing ship, then steam, then containers on massive vessels that could carry more in one voyage than 1,000 caravans combined. But here's the remarkable thing. Even though the Silk Road as a trade route declined and eventually disappeared, its legacy persists in countless ways. The cultural exchanges it enabled had permanently altered every civilization it touched. Chinese technology had spread westward, transforming everything from printing to metalwork. Islamic mathematics and science had influenced both East and West. Artistic traditions had cross-pollinated, creating hybrid styles that became traditions in their own right. Languages still carry loan words from the Silk Road era. English spinach comes from Persian, borrowed from Sanskrit. Orange traces through multiple languages from Sanskrit Naranga. Caravan itself is Persian. The list goes on, a linguistic record of contact and exchange. Cuisines worldwide show Silk Road influences. Think about what happened when foods met new lands. Pasta in Italy might have connections to noodles from China, though the exact history is debated by scholars who love a good food fight. What's certain is that techniques for making noodles traveled both directions, adapted everywhere they went. The Persian polo, that rice dish cooked with meat and spices, influenced Indian biryani and eventually spread as far as Spain. Tea, which started as a Chinese drink, became central to British culture, to Moroccan hospitality, to Japanese ceremony. Each culture took this simple leaf steeped in hot water and made it their own. Spices that traveled these routes completely transformed cooking in places that had never tasted them before. Imagine medieval European food before black pepper became common bland by our standards, preserved with salt and not much else. Then these tiny dried berries start arriving from India, and suddenly food has a whole new dimension. Saffron from Persia colored and flavored dishes from Spain to India. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, which most people couldn't even locate on a map, ended up in everything from Swedish pastries to Chinese five-spice powder. And it wasn't just about fancy ingredients for the wealthy. Techniques spread too. The way to make yogurt traveled from Central Asia in multiple directions. Methods for fermenting vegetables, for drying fruits, for preserving meat, all these practical skills moved along with the merchants. A Chinese technique for pickling might end up adapted in Persia, then change again when it reached the Mediterranean. Each culture added their local ingredients, their own twist, but you can still trace the connections if you look closely. Music and instruments traveled these routes too, creating sounds that mix traditions in ways that are still hard to untangle. The lute, which became central to European medieval music, probably originated in Central Asia or the Middle East. The word itself comes from Arabic aloud. Chinese instruments influenced Persian music, which influenced Turkish music, which influenced Greek music. You can hear these connections even now: certain scales, certain ways of ornamenting melodies, certain rhythms that appear across cultures that seem to have nothing in common until you remember they were all connected by these ancient roots. Even games spread along the Silk Road. Chess, which probably originated in India, traveled both east and west, transforming as it went. The Chinese version, Xiangqi, looks different from the Persian version, which looks different from the European version, but they're all recognizably related. Playing cards may have started in China and traveled west, evolving along the way. Backgammon has ancient origins in Persia but became popular far beyond. Medical knowledge was another major exchange. Chinese doctors had sophisticated understanding of certain conditions and treatments. Indian physicians had their own advanced knowledge, particularly in surgery and herbal medicine. Persian and Arab doctors synthesized knowledge from multiple traditions, adding their own observations and experiments. When these medical traditions met along the Silk Road, practitioners shared knowledge, learned from each other, sometimes competed, but often collaborated. A Chinese technique for acupuncture might intrigue a Persian physician. An Indian surgical procedure might get adapted and refined by Arab doctors. Greek medical texts, preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars, eventually made their way back to Europe, where they'd been mostly forgotten. The exchange of mathematical and astronomical knowledge particularly flourished along these routes. Indian mathematicians developed the concept of zero and the decimal system, innovations so fundamental we can barely imagine math without them. These ideas traveled west to the Islamic world, where scholars recognized their importance and built on them. Arab and Persian mathematicians made their own crucial contributions. Algebra, for instance, gets its name from Arabic. All this knowledge eventually reached Europe, where it sparked the mathematical revolution that made modern science possible. Religious traditions that spread along the Silk Road continue shaping billions of people's spiritual lives. Buddhism's transformation from an Indian religion to a Pan-Asian faith happened largely through Silk Road transmission. Islamic culture's flowering during the medieval period was intimately connected to its position along these routes. But here's what's fascinating: religions didn't just spread, they changed. Buddhism that reached China was different from Buddhism in India, adapted to Chinese philosophical traditions, blending with local beliefs. By the time it reached Japan, it had transformed again. Islam absorbed influences from the cultures it encountered, creating regional variations that maintained core beliefs while expressing them through local cultural forms. And the idea of the Silk Road itself has become a powerful metaphor. When modern leaders talk about connecting East and West, about cultural exchange and economic integration, they often invoke Silk Road imagery. China's current Belt and Road Initiative explicitly references this history, attempting to recreate through modern infrastructure the connections ancient merchants forged through individual courage. Archaeological work along the old routes continues, revealing new information. In Central Asia's dry climates, preservation can be remarkable. Textiles, paper documents, food remains, all can survive for centuries under the right conditions. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, sealed for centuries, contained a library of thousands of documents in multiple languages, providing insights into religious, commercial, and administrative life of a major Silk Road way station. Modern genetics is revealing Silk Road connections in our very DNA. Population studies show patterns of genetic mixing along the old routes, evidence of centuries of intermarriage and migration. The spread of certain genetic markers traces the same paths caravans followed, showing it wasn't just goods and ideas moving along these routes but people themselves, carrying their genes into new populations, creating the genetic diversity that characterizes modern Central Asian populations. Even the landscape bears lasting marks. The paths themselves are sometimes still visible, worn into stone by millennia of feet and hooves and wheels. Ruined caravanserais dot the routes, their mud brick walls slowly eroding but still recognizable. The great cities, those that survived, often still show in their street plans and building styles the cosmopolitan influences that made them wealthy. Samarkand's architectural jewels date from centuries after the Silk Road's peak, but they draw on traditions and techniques that the city learned during its time as a great trading center. Standing today in places like Xi'an or Samarkand or Istanbul, you can still feel echoes of that connected world. These cities remain crossroads, places where East and West meet, where the legacy of centuries of exchange remains visible in faces and languages and foods and buildings. The Silk Road may no longer function as a trade route, but it persists as a cultural reality, a shared history connecting distant peoples. What does the Silk Road teach us looking back? Maybe first that human beings have always been more connected than we sometimes think. The modern globalized world didn't invent international trade or cultural exchange, it just accelerated processes that have been ongoing throughout history. That Roman senator in his Chinese silk and that Chinese emperor on his Central Asian horse both lived in a globalized world, just one operating at the pace of camel caravans rather than container ships. The Silk Road also reminds us that cultural exchange isn't zero-sum, that interactions between different civilizations can enrich everyone rather than diminishing anyone. Every culture that touched the Silk Road took from it but also contributed to it, creating a system where innovations could spread and hybrid traditions could emerge. The notion that cultures must remain pure to retain value is contradicted by historical reality. The most vibrant, creative, prosperous cultures have always been those most open to exchange and influence. There's also something humbling about the scale of what these ancient peoples accomplished. Without modern technology, without engines or electronics or any of the tools we take for granted, they created a network spanning continents. They figured out how to cross deserts that kill, mountains that seem impassable, political boundaries that shifted like sand. They developed systems of credit and banking that let merchants trade across vast distances. They learned each other's languages, adapted to unfamiliar customs, found common ground with people who seemed completely alien. And they did it not once but continuously, for centuries, across generations. The Silk Road wasn't a short-lived achievement, but a sustained effort that required constant maintenance, constant adaptation, constant courage. Every merchant who set out knew the risks. Many didn't return. But enough did that the network persisted, that the connections deepened, that the benefits justified the costs. There's a kind of optimism embedded in the Silk Road story. It tells us that people from vastly different backgrounds can find ways to work together, to communicate, to create mutual benefit. It tells us that curiosity about the world and its people is a fundamental human trait, that we've always been driven to explore, to discover, to connect. It tells us that the barriers between cultures, language, religion, custom are real but not insurmountable, that trade and exchange can build bridges across even the widest gaps. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize it too much. The Silk Road was also a place of exploitation, of dangerous power imbalances, of suffering. The merchants grew wealthy while porters and camel drivers often lived hard, short lives. Slavery was common, wars were fought over control of routes. The cultural exchange wasn't always equal or voluntary. Like most of history, the Silk Road contains both light and shadow, achievement and tragedy. But what endures, what we remember, what still inspires us today is the sheer audacity of it. The idea that people could look at thousands of miles of hostile terrain and say, we can cross that, we can connect these distant places, we can make it worth the cost. And then they did it. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, they did it. Standing in a museum today, looking at a fragment of silk that traveled from China to Syria nearly 2,000 years ago, or examining a coin that shows how far trade networks reached, or reading a travel account that describes wonders the writer could barely believe, you're touching something profound. You're connecting with people who lived radically different lives but shared fundamental human drives: curiosity, ambition, the desire for beauty, the need to provide for family, the simple wish to see what lies beyond the horizon. The Silk Road tells us that distance isn't destiny, that separation isn't permanent, that the human urge to connect is stronger than the obstacles that divide us. In our own age of rapid globalization, of instant communication, of interconnected economies and cultures, we're really just continuing a story that began thousands of years ago on dusty roads crossing deserts and mountains. Those ancient merchants, leading their caravans through landscapes that would terrify most of us, were pioneers of globalization. They were building the world we inhabit today, creating connections that would eventually span the globe, establishing patterns of exchange that continue in new forms. When we buy products made on the other side of the world, when we taste foods from distant cultures, when we share ideas across continents in seconds, we are walking paths they first traced. The Silk Road reminds us that the world has always been bigger and more connected than any single culture's perspective. It teaches us that our ancestors were smarter, braver, and more capable than we sometimes give them credit for. It shows us that progress isn't linear, that sometimes the ancient world achieved things that took us centuries to rediscover or match. And maybe most importantly, it tells us that the effort to connect, to understand, to exchange with people different from ourselves is worthwhile. The Silk Road prospered not in spite of diversity, but because of it. The mixing of cultures, languages, technologies, and ideas wasn't a problem to be solved, but the source of the network's greatest value. Each culture contributed something unique, and all benefited from what others brought. In our own time, when division and isolation sometimes seem tempting, when walls, literal and metaphorical, get proposed as solutions, the Silk Road offers a different vision. It shows us what becomes possible when we build bridges instead, when we choose connection over separation, when we embrace the complexity and richness that comes from engaging with the wider world. The caravanserais may be ruins now, and the routes may be silent, but the Silk Road's true legacy isn't in stones or paths. It's in the proof that human beings can accomplish remarkable things when we work together across our differences. It's in the evidence that exchange and connection make us all richer, not just materially but culturally, intellectually, spiritually. It's in the reminder that we've always been one world, one human family, finding our way toward each other across whatever distances separate us. The Silk Road shows us that some of humanity's greatest achievements come not from isolation, but from contact, not from purity, but from mixing, not from staying put, but from venturing out to meet the unknown. It reminds us that the stranger from a distant land might bring not just exotic goods, but new ideas that transform our understanding, new techniques that improve our lives, new perspectives that expand our horizons. And perhaps it tells us something we need to hear right now, that despite all our differences, despite the vast distances and varied cultures and competing interests, human beings have always found ways to connect, to trade, to learn from each other, to build something larger than any one people could create alone. The Silk Road wasn't built by any single empire or culture. It was created by countless individuals from dozens of different peoples, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, following different customs, but all willing to take the risk of reaching out across the distances that separated them. That willingness to reach out, to take the risk of connection, to believe that what lies beyond the horizon is worth the journey, that's the Silk Road's deepest legacy. It's a legacy that lives on not just in museums and archaeological sites, but in every act of cultural exchange, every moment of curiosity about the wider world, every effort to build understanding across differences. And so we return from our journey through time, from those ancient roads where merchants led their caravans through landscapes both beautiful and terrible. Maybe as we've walked these paths together, you felt something of what countless travelers experienced, that mixture of wonder and fear, of exhaustion and exhilaration, of being small in a vast world while being part of something larger than yourself. Thank you for taking this time to explore these ancient connections with me. If this journey stirred something in you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Maybe you've visited one of these historic sites yourself, or perhaps this has inspired you to learn more about the fascinating ways our world has always been connected. Whatever thoughts this brought up, share them with our community here. Until we meet again for another exploration, I wish you safe travels through your own journeys, moments of connection across whatever distances you face, and the kind of curiosity that keeps us always looking toward the horizon, wondering what we might discover there. Take care, and thank you for being part of the Curator family.